Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. This video is going to be a long one, but hopefully a fun one. If you've been watching the channel recently, you'll know I'm doing a demon army. I've just done a sort of standard soul grinder, and I've shown on the channel already the base that's in this video here to make a kitbash soul grinder look bigger, more imposing, and also troll a friend that I'm playing in a tournament. So you'll see the base in the background there. It's a ruined grot tank that's already been featured on the channel. So now I'm going to show you what I'm doing for this kitbash. Now the kitbash was done alongside the standard soul grinder. You'll kind of see it in the background and the base, and then it was left in the leg stage that you're going to see shortly. So the first stage, the leg stage that I'm talking about here, is trying to make the soul grinder stand up and above this ruined grot tank that we've done. So what I'm doing here is separating the leg components. Now hopefully you've seen in the background there how I'm doing it. The legs come in two pieces, and it's kind of the top part of the leg, the kind of thigh I suppose you'd think of it, and then the kind of shin area. It's actually relatively easy to separate it. So all I've done is taken the clippers, just cut into that joint a little bit, scored it, bent it apart, and then cleaned it up like you're seeing here. And then we've ended up with these legs in the two pieces you see here. Now I'm taking a bit of blue tack and literally experimenting in getting it stood in the right place over the grot tank. Something I do quite a lot. Blue tack's really useful when you're doing a bigger kitbash like this, before you start gluing things on, gluing things together, just to get the pose right. Because up till this stage I'd been kind of holding the torso of the soul grinder over the grot tank, thinking, yeah, it's going to work, how do I repose the legs, and almost kind of working my way to it kind of in my head. So a bit of blue tack, a bit of testing, are you going to get the legs in the right place? Those kind of pieces really can help. Now if you've watched the base video, you'll know at this point I then got the legs all sealed together, had it all in one piece as you're seeing here, and then I marked the base so I knew where to kind of not put things so that this would stand in the right position. So this was very early stages, and then when I got to the leg stage, like in this kitbash, I thought, right, I'm going to do the base, get that done, because that'll be a separate video, a bit of fun. And then I did the original soul grinder completely, and then came back to doing this, mostly because I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to do the kitbash in total. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can have a great idea, start it and think, right, I'm now stuck for ideas. Nothing wrong with putting that to a side for a while, doing something else, coming back to it as you then experiment. And also it allowed me to finish the original soul grinder, and then that would then hopefully give some inspiration, give some ideas of posing, and so the parts I'd do. So here we are, very British, having a scone and a cup of tea while I dug out my Nurgle bits box, and I went through all of my Nurgle parts. So the parts straight in front of you, there's the soul grinder bits, and you see in the background I'd completely finished painting my original kind of unaltered soul grinder, and then we're at leg stage. So then I thought, right, I'm going to sit and I'm going to go through all my Nurgle bits box and hopefully get some inspiration as to what I was then going to do and what parts I was going to take to kitbash this up. Because like I say, I hadn't actually 100% decided how I was going to do it. Now in the end, it became not easy, but relatively easy to sort of pick the parts. And I literally picked just the spare parts from a previous Great Unclean one, and I've done several Great Unclean ones on the channel if you've seen that, and I have used Great Unclean one parts before to kitbash a Nurgle Knight, and I wasn't really planning just on doing the Great Unclean one parts, but that's how it ended up. Having gone through a whole bits box, those are the parts that fit completely and sensibly. So chopping up the sword first, and you see there, be careful when you're doing that, because as you just saw, I catapulted the sword that came on the soul grinder right across the room. So one of the great parts that fits really well is the sword from the Great Unclean one. So what I'm doing here is taking the hand out of the Great Unclean one sword, so slicing the sword end off, slicing the handle end off, and then it's the opposite for the soul grinder sword. So with the soul grinder sword, you wanted to keep the hand. So that's how we separated the two swords. Marking the top end of the sword there and taking a pin drill and just drilling a hole into the top end of the sword. So what I did here is drilled a hole for a pin to go into the top of the Great Unclean one sword. I drilled right through the hand from the soul grinder, and then I drilled into the handle of the Great Unclean one sword. Pushed a bit of milliput into either end. You could use green stuff, any kind of two-part resin thing, and this really is to just make sure the hole is actually filled and tight. And also it gives a bit of contact surface. You saw that I put a bit of super glue on as well. It gives a bit of contact surface for everything to grip together to when you're putting this part together. And then the pin goes right in the middle and just gives that extra bit of stability. Now you could get away with doing it without the pin and doing it just with pure, poly cement and melting the plastic parts together. But I needed to put a little bit of extra size back into the handle because I cut it a bit too short. And also I think it just gives a bit of longer longevity. Now I have then left that sword to thoroughly set and dry, which you do need to do with that kind of milliput or green stuff. Let it to fully set and dry before moving on to this part. Now this part is getting the sword into the arm of the soul grinder. Now it won't quite fit because you've put a larger sword on than was actually being held by the soul grinder originally. So it takes a little bit more room to sort of angle that sword in. So again, using some milliput that I've mixed up, and then putting that into all the gaps and cracks, and then using a simple sculpting tool, a bit of water, and then roughly sculpting a similar musculature that's on that arm already. Nothing too fancy, it's not too difficult. And then again, put that to one side to thoroughly set before moving on. Now, what I have done in the background of this, you can see that I've built the body of the soul grinder. I've also started experimenting with some tentacle parts, and this here is going to be the head of the soul grinder. I did test the Great Unclean One heads and thought, no, they're too big. So this is actually the left arm of Rotigus, one of the special character greater demons. And again, the spare parts you're going to be left with if you buy a greater demon to do this, you're going to end up with a Great Unclean One, and then you're going to end up with a different set of spare parts depending how you build the Great Unclean One. So if you build Rotigus, you won't have this spare part. If you build one with the sword, you won't have the sword spare part. But it does give you two other really cool options to build if you want to do this exact build here. But Rotigus' obviously left arm has got a hand sticking out of it, so I've cut off those fingers you saw there. And then this other piece that I'm now using milliput around is kind of the bit that goes on the back of his hand with some tentacles on, but it's got the other part of the fingers on. So basically I've chopped off the fingers, pushed a plug of milliput into this kind of two pieces, sculpted it roughly around, and then what I'm taking here, these are tiny balls of milliput and green stuff that, not every time, but fairly often, whenever I've got any spare milliput or green stuff left in a project, I'll make a series of tiny balls, literally roll them in the palm of your hand, drop them onto the table, let them set, various different sizes, because these are a great way of Nurglifying up your sculpted areas. Because sculpting a large flat area can be tricky. Whereas if you do a sort of large flat area, roughly put some musculature in, some lines and striations and things, and then drop a couple of these little milliput and green stuff balls, it just instantly Nurgles it up, makes your life a lot easier. Now getting the head to fit into the body, it's not as simple as just kind of sticking it on. So really trying to cut it down a little bit so that it will slot into the torso just that bit easier. You can be very rough and ready with this, and this is a beautiful thing about Nurgle conversions, or should I say disgusting thing? It is Nurgle after all. But it's the really good thing about Nurgle conversions. You can be a bit rough and ready, and it doesn't really matter, because when you're doing the next stages and you fill in the gaps of the milliput or the green stuff or whatever you're going to use, it's Nurgle. So I've cut it to size, stuck the torso onto the legs, let it set again, because again, each stage, if you give a bit of time to set, and this was done over the course of a number of evenings, or I did a bit in the morning before going to work, 4 o'clock in the morning doing conversions is a completely normal thing to do, and then finishing it off on a night, whatever it is, but give yourself time in between for stages to set. Now putting the head on, literally a big plug of milliput that I've mixed, stuffed it into the torso, pushed the head onto the top of it, and we're literally using the milliput as what's going to glue the head in. Didn't do too much sculpting or anything like that to make it look pretty at this point, roughly made it look nice, left it for a second, and then I'm going through these spare parts from the Great Unclean Ones and looking for any spare bits that will fit into the gaps I've created to mean I don't have to then sculpt gross bits, fleshy bits, whatever. So I just found this kind of little bit of a strip that I think is from the chest area of the Great Unclean One, where it's like a boil sticking out. So cut that out, trimmed it down, stuck it on. Found this other piece here, which again is a tentacly part that I think goes on part of the neck of the Great Unclean One. Chopped it up and around, it's got a couple of tentacles and a couple of bits of manky skin area. And again, pushed it into that blob of green stuff on the shoulder. So you could almost do a match of this if you're doing it yourself, or you could do any old random parts for gross nurgly stuff. And again, what I've done then, before it's set, if there was an area that is going to be flat and level with what's going to be left in the conversion, I've then put some sort of muscular striations in, put some little balls of green stuff in to make it Nurgled up. Now hopefully you saw that on the desk, 3 parts from the Great Unclean One that I'm going to use. One I think is like a part of an arm, so it's like an arm muscle area. I think this is the piece I'm putting in here. The sort of mouth area that goes on the belly of a Great Unclean One, and that's an optional one as well. You can have spilled guts, or you can have the kind of teeth. So again, got the spare teeth one. And then the bottom part, again, is just a small piece of the Great Unclean Ones. These are all spare bits from the various optional builds of the Great Unclean One you can do. This is all off a single set of spare parts from Great Unclean One. So I know I've done 3 Great Unclean Ones on the channel, but all these spare parts are just from one. So again, hopefully you've seen him experiment, so putting the blob on different sizes. If you see there, I'm taking the piece off and on and putting a bit more milliput on to get the size. While milliput is still drying, don't worry about taking things off and on if you make that mistake. Like I say, I get to this point here and go, well, I'm not quite happy with the tongue that I've put in, so pull that out and then chop this up to cut it down so it's not got this kind of larger area around. And this is actually the one thing that is from a second Great Unclean one, because this tongue piece, as you'll notice, is actually in the mouth of the Rotigus arm that I'm using. So you wouldn't be able to do this piece if you only bought one Great Unclean one, because you'd need this tongue and this thing for the head you're using. So you could find something else or leave the tongue off entirely. Doesn't matter. You could sculpt your own out of a bit of green stuff, however you want to do it. But really, there's no need to have this kind of tongue in there. But that's kind of what I did. A little bob of milliput in there, as you can see, and then push the tongue in and then reassembled it where I've got it already. So nothing wrong with when you've got all the parts on that you think are correct, going, do you know what, I'm just going to yank this off and start it again, or yank this off and experiment with it again. But what I was kind of going for here was just a big bloated, gross Nurgle belly with a few of those Nurgle extra parts pushed in there to really make it, bigger, bulkier and things than the standard soul grinder. So this is a little 360 of where I got to at that point. So I've put the belly on, we've kind of let this set, we've put some of that milliput around the back to start bulking out to the back area. And then I was thinking about what's going to go next. Now these are two horns that again go on a Great Unclean one, so I have to keep repeating myself. And I was thinking, are these going to work anywhere? So again, just showing you that when I'm doing the build, sometimes you do experiment and you're not 100% sure if it's going to work. I was fairly certain, and I freed up both of these horns from the sprue, cut the end down to kind of think, right, how am I going to seal this onto the back, and then tested it with a little bit of blue tack again. Just because when you get to a point where you think, is it going to go too much? Is it going to be not enough? Blue tacking a couple of parts on really kind of fits, and you can sort of look and think, do I like the dynamic of the model? Would I stick it in a different place? If you start slapping glue on too early sometimes, you could mess up the models and that kind of stuff, because again, this is going to be plastic, kind of on plastic. You could put some milliput on the end, push it in, start sculpting it and going, I'm changing my mind, I'm pulling it off, which is fine, and I've said already, do that, that's not a problem if you know roughly what you're doing and you're putting parts on. But sometimes it's easier to do this bit of blue tack and then you think, right, I'm not going to ruin this piece for a later build or whatever. Now I'm sticking these on in a totally different way, because it's going plastic to plastic on the back, and I didn't really want it to be the same all around, had the same techniques I'm using things. This is what we call sprue goo, which is bits of plastic melted into a pot of polycement, and it gives this real thick, gooey kind of, goo, sprue goo really. So this is literally melted plastic in polycement, putting a blob of it on there, pushing it onto the model there, so it is plastic to plastic, and then this then sets, and it will set like solid plastic, and it gives a little bit more of a sort of oozing, slightly more natural, if that's the word, effect to the join. So rather than doing the milliput and then sculpting it and putting the blobs in, this looks like a kind of weird, kind of melted, kind of bone effect that's going to be coming out the back. So just something slightly different there, and different techniques to build the model. So again, once it's thoroughly dried, moving on to the next stage. So the stomach now is fully dried with all that milliput and all that solid stuff. The horns I've put on coming out the back is fully dried. And now I'm fixing the arm, and I've built the arm, the left arm, standard soul grinder arm, and I'm putting it in. So I've drilled a hole into that milliput, drilling a hole into the arm, and again just reinforcing slightly with a bit of pinning wire into the two parts to give a little bit of extra stability to it while it's setting. Because again, I am setting this together with a big blob of milliput in the middle, the pinning wire going through into the two different holes, pushing it together, roughly sculpting it down a little bit, not the finished effect, but just basically pressing it down so the milliput is contacting both sides of the model, kind of all around it, and this will seal this model together. And it really does go rock solid, because milliput dries completely solid, which is why I'm using milliput a lot of this rather than green stuff. It's also a lot cheaper than green stuff. So I find for doing conversions like this, where I'm using it to kind of solidify the model, I find milliput better than green stuff. Green stuff gives a little bit of flex, so if you're going to drop your models or knock them a lot or whatever, maybe you might want to use green stuff rather than milliput. Now it's time to make the model look pretty, if that's the word. So going around all these areas where we've got all these join areas, all these join marks where the actual, currently the milliput is lower than the kind of plastic areas. So I'm putting an extra bit of milliput in, smoothing it around here with a sculpt tool, you can see, dressing it out, making it sort of fit with it, using these milliput and green stuff balls in there to sort of Nurgle it up. Now this area on his left shoulder, I'm making this a little bit sort of mankier looking than the other skin, so just using the end of a sculpting tool and dotting in lots of little indentations and things to make it look more kind of pustuly and gross. If it's an area where there's a tentacle, you can see there, I'm trying to make that look like a sculpted part of the model, so putting a little join line in between the tentacles, smoothing the skin down. So two different effects is kind of what I'm working on. Similar, move around to the belly. I want to make the belly look like it's, you know, a real model and a real thing, so I don't want it too thin, don't want it too fat. So again, playing and experimenting. And here you can see trying to take the kind of stomach folds that are on the piece of plastic that's moulded on into the area that I've added. I'm going to put the Nurgling you saw there onto it, and that'll cover up a big chunk of the stomach. Not the world's best sculptor by any means, and actually if I can use a piece of model that exists already to cover a big chunk of this belly, that's what I'm going to do, because that way then it kind of stops me having to sculpt too much, make a few less mistakes, and it's going to look slightly better, because let's be honest, a Nurgling that's been sculpted by an expert is going to look a lot better than what I can sculpt out of milliput. But I'm going around working on all these stomach areas you see here, making the pieces mesh in, putting the milliput up to it, taking these balls, popping them in, and basically Nurglifying all the skin areas. And that's, you know, took a while. I think this was done over a course of a couple of evenings, this one, and just take your time on it if you're going to do the same thing. Keep looking at the model, thinking, does it look right? Do I need to put an extra bit of a belly on? Do I need to do some of the pieces? And in the background, if you see there, if you see, and it doesn't stand out necessarily, you'll see two little blue bricks. That's kind of two moulds that I've taken from blue stuff from previous projects. And you'll see over the course of a couple of nights, when I've finished using the milliput, I'm then filling those moulds with some of this milliput that's spare for later projects, for casting things up. So if you do it over the course of a night, if you mix too much milliput, either make some milliput balls for the later project, drop it into a casting that you've done before, so there's going to be no real waste over the project. Now I'm taking a pin drill, so all the casting and all the extra bits and all the skin bits done. I'm now trying to make it mesh together. So a couple of different sizes of drill bits, and I'm drilling holes, a couple of large ones at the back you saw there, and then these ones are very, very small. The reason I'm doing this is when you look at an actual Great Unclean one, they've got these little balls and these pustules that stick out of the skin, but they've also got little indentations near those balls. So this is what I'm representing. Little indentations into the skin to make it fit and match with the Great Unclean One's skin that's already there. Not too many, don't go crazy on it, but put it there so it really matches in. So when you spray paint this model, this is the finished article, not painted yet, you'll see that in a second. And I think actually those skin areas really, really work together. I'm really happy with how this build has gone. Look, Nurgle's definitely a lot easier to convert than others. This is the finished build. This is painted. If you want to see a painting scheme, drop a comment down below and I might do a painting video, but it's painted in a very similar way to the previous Soul Grinder. And I think this finished build is just so much better than the original Soul Grinder, if I do say so myself. It is much bigger, it stands much taller, it's much more imposing, and I think it looks much more freaky and demonic. So I hope that witter and waffle made some sense. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.